I'm Andrew. I was born in May.
Oh, well. What does that say?
That's not quite summer, is it?
No,
It's
not
spring.
quite. And both mine were born in May.
We spring into summer. All that in the next hour, and with us for the duration, Deputy First Minister of Scotland and Deputy SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon. It's nice to have you in London for a change,
Nice
rather
to be
than
here.
down the line.
Lucky to make it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe next time you come, it'll be a foreign city. But don't panic. For those of you who like a bit of balance on these issues, and we know there are many of you, the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Carmichael, that's his name, not a household name in England, but he'll be our guest on the day of a show sometime next month.
Let's start with the weather. We've done that most of the week, and what weather it's been. Tens of thousands of homes are without power after hurricane-force winds battered the UK yesterday. Forecasters say the stormy weather will subside briefly today before more gales and rain arrive tomorrow. Western parts of Wales and the northwest of England have been badly affected, and severe flood warnings remain in place in the south and southwest of England. The Transport Secretary told the Commons this morning that £61 million would be spent to help repair the damage to transport infrastructure. The bad weather has prompted widespread debate about the role played by climate change. Later today, the Energy Secretary, Ed Davey, he's a Liberal Democrat, will use a speech to attack some Conservatives, whom he says are undermining efforts to tackle climate change. Mr Davey will say that the political consensus on climate change is in danger of breaking down. The Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, reinforced the message on his regular radio phone-in for LBC this morning.
There are prominent Conservatives, Lord Lawson, a lot of other Conservatives, who just don't accept it. Now, they're perfectly entitled to that view, and they can argue their case as they do. I just think that given that we've recently had this international report from the largest number of scientists ever, and we have received, by the way, around the Cabinet table, formal advice from the Chief Scientific Officer to the government, so there's not a politician, and he came to the Cabinet, and he sat there in front of David Cameron, myself, and said, there is just no doubt. This is happening, it is very destructive, and it is going to get worse, and we have to do something about it.
Lib Dem leader Nick Clegg. Nicola Sturgeon, do you think the extreme weather that we've experienced, not just with the recent floods, but over the last few years, is that linked to climate change?
Oh, undoubtedly, I agree with Nick Clegg. You know, people are entitled to their views, but I think we need to spend all of our energies deciding how we address climate change rather than arguing over whether it's the cause or not. I mean, obviously, what's happening in the south of England particularly is grim. My heart goes out to people affected. We've got off so far, although we're not complacent, relatively lightly in Scotland, but we remain very vigilant. But there's no doubt that we have to take climate change seriously, stop arguing about whether it's a reality or not, and focus on how we deal with it.
Well, Nick Clegg mentioned Lord Lawson, former Conservative Chancellor. I mean, he said again today there's no evidence that climate change is leading to more extreme weather. And actually, he says the government should use the floods as a wake-up call to stop littering the countryside with wind turbines and solar panels, that what Britain needs is cheap and reliable forms of energy. Does he have a point?
Well, no, I don't. I mean, he's entitled to his view, but I think it's completely wrong to say there's no evidence that links climate change with weather. I do think making sure we're investing in renewable energy is important. We're doing that heavily in Scotland, not just in wind, but we need to have a balanced energy policy. Of course, there's some immediate issues that need to be dealt with in terms of relief for people affected, looking at how we build better flood defences. I think that's going to be a big priority for the government in London as a result of what's happened in the last few weeks. But, you know, my point would be, let's stop arguing about whether or not climate change is the reason here, and think seriously about how we better address it.
You say they're entitled to their views, but should those views now be dismissed out of hand in your mind? That seems to be what
I think
Ed
there's a
Davey
fine
saying.
line between saying, you know, views should be not expressed. I mean, people are entitled to express them, but I do think I absolutely
Should be ignored.
agree. Well, I think we should treat them with healthy scepticism and not allow ourselves to be diverted into a debate about the rights and wrongs of the climate change argument. You know, people who are suffering from flooding in Somerset just now, for example, you know, will get very little comfort from this debate. What they want to know is what's been done in the here and now, and how, as a society, we face up to these things for the longer term.
Although climate change sceptics do point to scientific evidence that also says it's not necessarily all man-made, it's not necessarily down to human activity. Surely those views need to be part of that debate too.
I'm not saying these views shouldn't be expressed. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a debate. I simply think that it is kind of wasted energy necessarily having all of it spent on that debate rather than thinking about what we're going to do to address the issues of climate change.
I mean, you talked about Scotland leading the way in terms of renewables. I mean, were you disappointed when Scotland failed to meet its climate change targets for the second consecutive year, according to the Greenhouse?
So we marginally failed, not that I was marginally disappointed.
Well, you did marginally fail it, but...
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been disappointing for you, bearing in mind it's such a big...
Of course, you know, I want to see us meet our targets. I want to see us exceed our targets.
Are you going to be able to meet them?
Yes, we're confident of that. We passed the climate change legislation that at the time we passed it was world leading. So, you know, we're stretching ourselves. We're being ambitious. We fell very marginally short. But, you know, in a sense, that is almost us becoming the victim of our own ambition there. But that shouldn't put us off striving to do that and continue to do that.
All right, let's leave it there. It's now time for our daily quiz. And the question for today is, which of the following has our guest of the day, Nicola Sturgeon, admitted that she doesn't like? Is it A, the sound of bagpipes, B, being Alex Salmond's deputy, C, historical fiction, or D, cooking? Later on in the show, I'm sure Nicola will give us the right answer.
I'm having to think about what the right answer is. Oh, I know what it is.
You have to be honest.
I know what it is.
What are you suggesting, Andrew?
Sorry.